When Clarice Rowland walked into the grand lobby of the Rowland Suites, her own creation, the crown jewel of a hospitality empire she had built from the ground up, she was met not with welcome, but with quiet dismissal. Dressed in a simple cardigan, well-worn jeans and shoes that bore the marks of everyday wear, she didn't match the opulence the front desk clerk expected from guests of a five-star establishment. The chandeliers sparkled, the marble gleamed, and soft jazz filled the space. Yet, none of it could mask the tension that silently formed between appearance and perception. Kay, the young receptionist behind the gleaming counter, looked up, and in that split second made a judgment. This woman, standing alone with no visible signs of wealth, could not possibly be a guest here, let alone a VIP. It was a momentary decision, but it carried the weight of a culture shaped more by surface impressions than substance. Clarice asked for a room, her voice steady, her manner courteous, but Kay's answer came quickly and with a practiced smile. No vacancies. She didn't check the system. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look closely. And in that one moment, the rot beneath the polish of hospitality revealed itself. Kay's assumption, casual and instantaneous, was one of the most common errors in human judgment, mistaking appearance for worth. It was not just an individual oversight, but a reflection of a wider issue that permeated the luxury hospitality industry, a reliance on visual cues to determine status and importance. She failed to notice the confidence in Clarice's posture, the calm command in her tone, the deliberate way she scanned the room, signs of a woman who not only belonged but had built this very empire. Kay's eyes had been trained to seek designer bags, expensive jewelry, and name-droppable clientele. In doing so, she missed the opportunity to witness something extraordinary, the quiet return of a founder in her own space. The irony, thick and palpable, would only become clear later when Kay was called into a meeting with senior management and saw Clarice seated at the head of the table. In that moment, the weight of her mistake settled in. She had not just turned away a guest. She had failed to recognize greatness shaped by grit. Not Clarice's reaction was perhaps the most powerful part of the entire incident. She did not raise her voice, demand to speak with management or flash her credentials in retaliation. Instead, she observed, with every unjustified denial and every dismissive glance, she catalogued the cracks in her brand's foundation. She knew that shouting would draw attention, but reflection would spark introspection, and that is the tool she preferred. Her silence was not passive, it was purposeful. In her calm composure, Clarice demonstrated the kind of restraint that comes only from deep strength and a long history of being underestimated. And it worked. The energy in the lobby shifted. The security guard fidgeted. A housekeeper paused mid-step. People noticed, not just because they began to recognize who she was, but because her silence made them examine their own complicity in a moment of injustice. The discomfort was not in what was said, but in what was not. Clarice's demeanor sent a clear message. Dignity does not shout, it stands. The core of Rowland Suites' founding principles was radical in its simplicity. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they arrive in a limousine or on foot. Clarice had always believed that the measure of a company's character lies in how it treats those who offer nothing material in return. When she began her journey into hospitality, it wasn't to cater to the elite, but to build spaces where every guest, regardless of income, ethnicity, dress, or background, felt seen. It was this belief that made her rejection at her own front desk all the more jarring. How could a place built on respect now reflect the very hierarchies it was meant to dismantle? Her disappointment wasn't rooted in personal offense. It was professional heartbreak. Clarice knew the culture had drifted, and as she looked around that day at the immaculate lobby, at the polished performance of hospitality stripped of empathy, she made a decision. The standard of respect needed to be re-established, not just as a policy, but as a non-negotiable part of the brand's identity. The issue went far beyond a single employee's mistake. Kay's reaction was symptomatic of a deeper problem, an organizational blind spot that had been growing quietly, even as the brand expanded and revenues climbed. The training modules emphasized protocol, but didn't interrogate bias. The customer service scripts taught politeness, but not humanity. And in the race to cater to luxury clientele, the hotel had begun to attract a culture where judgment often masqueraded as discernment. Clarice understood that no business, no matter how well-intentioned, is immune to the dangers of systemic oversight. It wasn't enough to chastise or remove one employee. The system itself had to be examined, reformed, and rebuilt. Her return had unintentionally become a stress test, and the structure had buckled. But in that failure lay the opportunity for something greater, a return to values, a commitment to growth, and the chance to create a hospitality environment that no longer just looked impressive, but was deeply authentically inclusive. It was time to rebuild from the inside out. When the situation was fully revealed, the front desk's misjudgment, the staff's silence, the brand's failure to uphold its founding principles, many expected a swift, punitive response. Firing the receptionist, issuing statements, and moving on would have been the standard corporate reaction. But Clarice had never been a standard leader. Instead, she offered Kay a rare and powerful opportunity: redemption through responsibility. Rather than dismiss her outright, Clarice required Kay to reapply for her position, not out of cruelty, but to initiate a process of reflection and personal growth. It was a test, not just of her qualifications, but of her willingness to confront her bias, to learn from the experience and to evolve into someone who could help rebuild the culture she had unintentionally betrayed. The move sent a strong message throughout the company. Mistakes, while serious, are also human. What mattered more was the response, the effort to make amends, to change behavior, and to align with the deeper mission of the brand. Clarice knew that sustainable change didn't come from punishment. It came from conscious transformation. In the days following the incident, Clarice scheduled a mandatory staff meeting, not to reprimand, but to engage. She stood in front of her employees not as a distant executive, but as a woman with a story, a purpose, and a deep commitment to the soul of hospitality. She spoke candidly about what had happened and, more importantly, why it mattered. Her tone wasn't angry. It was intentional. She asked difficult questions. What does professionalism really look like? How does judgment undermine service? Where had the culture shifted without anyone noticing? She didn't deliver a monologue. She invited a dialogue. Clarice listened, encouraged vulnerability, and reminded the team that empathy is a skill, not a sentiment. It can be learned, cultivated, and embedded into every interaction. Her leadership wasn't performative. It was participatory. And in that room, something began to shift. Walls of defensiveness cracked. Honest reflections surfaced. Employees realized that the incident wasn't just a failure of one. It was a moment for collective awakening. That day, empathy stopped being a buzzword and became the blueprint for change. As Clarice spoke, she shared a memory that had never left her, a moment in 1982 when she, as a young woman with ambition and no money, had been turned away from a hotel lobby just like this one. She had saved for weeks to afford a single night of rest on her first business trip, only to be told she didn't belong. That humiliation, that sense of invisibility, became the fuel for her life's work. It wasn't revenge she had sought, but reinvention, a place where no one would feel the way she once had. The silence in the room deepened as her words settled over the staff. Her story wasn't just emotional, it was instructive. It illustrated that hospitality was never just about beds, meals, or service. It was about belonging. That moment from decades ago had given birth to an empire, and now the memory of it was reigniting her mission. The staff saw not just a CEO before them, but a survivor of discrimination, a visionary forged in the fire of exclusion, and a builder of bridges where doors had once been slammed. Clarice knew that titles meant little without action. It was one thing to preach equality and dignity. It was another to model it in the quiet decisions made behind the scenes. She had always believed leadership was measured not in volume, but in values, how one shows up when no one is watching. She didn't occupy the penthouse suite on her visits. She stayed in the same rooms offered to guests. She didn't demand gourmet meals from the kitchen. She often ate the same soup served in the staff cafeteria because she'd helped develop that menu herself. ensuring it met not just nutritional standards but the emotional warmth food should carry. She walked the back corridors of her hotels as often as the front ones, greeting housekeepers, engineers, and porters by name. When the moment came to address the crisis, she didn't deliver mandates from the top floor. She stood beside her employees and acknowledged the gaps they all needed to bridge together. By holding herself to the highest standards of humility and integrity, she showed everyone that true leadership doesn't speak from above. It walks beside. Change wasn't a memo, it was a movement. Clarice understood that policies alone couldn't prevent bias, and training couldn't substitute for culture. In the wake of the incident, she announced a series of immediate policy shifts, not for optics, but for transformation. The first was mandatory empathy training, rooted in storytelling, perspective-taking, and self-awareness. But she didn't stop there. She instituted monthly roundtable discussions, where staff from all departments and seniority levels would come together, not just to air grievances, but to share insights, experiences, and solutions. These weren't passive listening sessions, they were active rebuilding labs. She created an anonymous platform for reporting and addressing microaggressions, reinforced internal promotions for those embodying the brand's values, and introduced new hiring criteria that prioritized emotional intelligence as much as technical skill. Culture, she knew, was built in the small decisions, the daily choices that shaped how people felt at work. And now, the culture at Rowland Suites would be redefined, not by luxury but by humanity. That, Clarice insisted, was the real gold standard. It wasn't just the glaring act of rejection that Clarice focused on. It was also the quieter inactions that revealed how far the brand had strayed from its values. 2 staff members, the security guard and a housekeeper, recognized her during the incident but remained silent. They later admitted that they had seen her photo in company newsletters and internal announcements, yet chose not to intervene. Their silence wasn't born of malice, but of uncertainty, fear, and a culture that had slowly eroded the courage to speak up. Clarice didn't scold them. Instead, she used their hesitation as a case study in how micro-moments define a brand. She asked, "What makes someone feel empowered to act in the face of wrong? What stops them?" She emphasized that it's the smallest actions, a kind word, a gentle correction, a willingness to interrupt bias, that shape the moral fabric of an organization. Rowland Suites had invested millions in aesthetics, but now it needed to invest deeply in its people's sense of agency. A brand isn't built in boardrooms, it's built at front desks, in laundry rooms, and in the brief, powerful seconds where someone chooses to do the right thing. Clarice had always believed that the heart of hospitality wasn't polished surfaces or scripted greetings, it was personal connection. She made a habit of learning the names of employees, from the marketing director to the night janitor. She remembered stories, whose child was applying to college, whose mother was recovering from surgery, whose niece wanted to be a chef. She understood that when you remember someone's name, you're telling them they matter. That mindset extended to guests too. For Clarice, checking in a traveler wasn't about room keys and Wi-Fi codes. It was about discovering why they were, hear what they hoped to find, what brought them peace. After the incident, she reminded her staff that seeing someone isn't just about eye contact. It's about attention, intention, and humanity. A hotel could dazzle with chandeliers and marble, but true luxury was emotional, being understood, valued, and respected. She didn't want robotic service, she wanted soulful connection. That's what set Rowland Suites apart, or should have. Now it was time to reclaim that essence, one conversation at a time. Before she departed the hotel that week, Clarice did something she hadn't done in years. She handwrote letters, one for each department, one for the receptionist, one for the security team, and one for the executive leadership. In elegant script and steady lines, she reflected on the lessons of the past days, acknowledged the pain and discomfort they had unearthed, and recommitted herself and the company to a better future. She thanked the housekeeper for her kindness, encouraged the receptionist to keep growing, and reminded the leadership team that systems don't change themselves. People do. The letters weren't grand gestures meant for PR. They were deeply personal reminders that change lives in the details. She slipped them into envelopes and left them in staff mailboxes, trusting the words to speak long after she was gone. These letters became artifacts of care, passed around, quoted in team meetings, tacked to bulletin boards. They carried more than just ink. They carried legacy. Because in the end, Clarice knew, leadership is less about sweeping declarations and more about consistent, deliberate acts of kindness. In a world that increasingly rewards spectacle, Clarice had long championed the quieter virtue of consistency. She wasn't interested in staff pulling out red carpets for VIPs while neglecting everyday guests. She didn't care for public apologies if they weren't backed by private accountability. She made it clear that she didn't want performances. She wanted principles. Anyone can shine once, but who shows up every day with respect, with presence, with care? That's what she valued. After the incident, she challenged her entire organization to recalibrate its compass, to be just as attentive to the solo traveler as to the billionaire. To deliver service not because someone deserves it, but because it's the right thing to do. Grand gestures may win headlines, but it's the repeated small decisions, the ones no one sees, that define culture. True excellence, she reminded, them isn't dramatic. It's dependable. It's showing up fully even when no one is watching. And that's the standard she expected to be met. Not with applause, but with quiet integrity. Clarice's final message wasn't delivered from a podium. It was shown through how she lived. Despite being a multimillionaire and one of the most respected women in business, she never put herself above the mission. She stayed in modest rooms in her own hotels, not out of frugality, but out of solidarity. She joined the kitchen staff, in meal prep not as a PR stunt, but because she genuinely enjoyed the work and respected the team. She listened more than she spoke, and when employees offered suggestions, she took notes, literally. Her humility wasn't the absence of pride. It was the presence of perspective. She knew where she had come from. She knew what it felt like to be overlooked, and she made sure her leadership was never used as a shield from criticism, but as an invitation to collaborate. In the end, her most powerful legacy was not the luxury of her hotels, but the grounded way in which she led. She reminded everyone that true success isn't about being above others. It's about lifting others as you rise and never forgetting the road you once walked.